13 years old, pregnant. England's future dynasty depended on whether she lived or died. The year is 1455. England is torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, two rival dynasties, Lancaster and York, locked in a brutal struggle for the crown. But hidden beneath the clash of kings and noblemen is the quiet, devastating story of a girl. Her name is Margaret Beaufort. She is not yet a woman, not yet even fully grown. At just 13 years old, she is forced into a marriage arranged not for love, but for power. And within a year, she will carry within her the fragile hope of her family's survival, an heir to the House of Lancaster. Imagine it. A girl who should still be playing with dolls or learning her letters, suddenly thrust into the violent world of dynastic politics. Her small frame and fragile body are hardly prepared for childbirth, yet she will endure one of the most dangerous labors of her time, giving birth at 13, to a boy who will one day become King Henry VII of England, founder of the Tudor Dynasty. But survival is never guaranteed. Margaret's labor nearly kills her. She is left physically scarred, unable to bear more children. And yet her son, her only child, will change the course of English history forever. This is not a tale of romance or triumph. It is a story of sacrifice, endurance, and haunting tragedy. For the rest of her life, Lady Margaret Beaufort will walk a razor's edge between power and powerlessness, shaping kingdoms through strategy, devotion, and sheer determination. Behind the crown her son wears lies the shadow of her suffering, of a girlhood stolen and a body broken before it had even fully grown. Tonight, we step back into the candlelit halls of medieval England to uncover the untold tragedy of Lady Margaret Beaufort. We will explore how her pregnancy at 13 was not simply a personal ordeal, but a moment that altered the destiny of a nation. Would England have ever seen the rise of the Tudors without this child mother's sacrifice? Or was the dynasty born not from triumph, but from blood and sorrow? Stay with me as we unravel the story of the girl who gave England a king, at a cost so great that it haunted her for the rest of her days. To understand the tragedy of Lady Margaret Beaufort, we must first step into the turbulent world of 15th century England, a land caught in the grip of civil war and dynastic ambition. The mid-1400s were an age of instability and fear. The crown of England was no stable prize. It was a throne haunted by whispers, conspiracies, and shifting loyalties. The Wars of the Roses, beginning in 1455, tore England apart. The rival houses of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and York, symbolized by the white, clashed endlessly for dominance. Nobles shifted sides like shadows at dusk, and the common people suffered as their fields and villages were ravaged. But beneath the clash of armies lay something deeper: bloodlines, inherited rather than earned. A woman's body could become the battleground on which dynasties fought. Marriage was not about choice or affection. It was about alliances. A girl's worth could be measured in her womb, in her ability to produce an heir. And this was the world into which Margaret Beaufort was born in 1443. She was the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III, and through him, she carried the blood of Lancaster. That blood made her valuable, but also vulnerable. Her father, John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, died when she was just an infant, leaving her a wealthy heiress. This wealth and lineage made her a prize in the political marriage market. The girl never had the luxury of a childhood free from politics. Her life was scripted by others, her future sealed before she could even form her own desires. By the age of 12, Margaret was already being discussed as a bride who could secure Lancaster's survival. At that time, child marriage was not unusual among the nobility. Girls could be betrothed or married before puberty, though consummation was often delayed. But in Margaret's case, destiny moved faster and more cruelly. The man chosen for her was Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI. Edmund was in his mid-20s, more than a decade older than the child bride he married in 1455. For him, the marriage was not about love, but about power, securing the Beaufort fortune and, more importantly, producing a Lancaster heir. For Margaret, it was a contract sealed in ink and blood. When Margaret became pregnant soon after, her youth made the danger clear. Pregnancy and childbirth were already deadly risks for women of any age in the 15th century, when medicine was primitive and infections were often fatal. But for a 13-year-old girl, the risk was extreme. Her body was still growing, her bones not yet fully developed, and her pelvis narrow. The ordeal would nearly destroy her. To make matters worse, fate struck another cruel blow. Edmund Tudor, her husband, was captured during the Wars of the Roses and died of plague in captivity before Margaret gave birth. Widowed before her 14th birthday, Margaret was left alone, heavily pregnant, and caught between the dangers of childbirth and the dangers of politics. When the time came, she was taken to Pembroke Castle in Wales, where she went into labor. The child born from her suffering was Henry Tudor, the boy who, decades later, would return from exile and defeat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, claiming the crown as Henry VII of England. But at the moment of his birth in January 1457, none of that glory was certain. What was certain was the toll it took on Margaret. She was so physically damaged by the brutal childbirth that she could never bear another child. Candlelit chambers where Margaret labored. Another kind of battle was being fought. The struggle between life and death, childhood and forced motherhood, destiny and destruction. Her world was one where the crown mattered more than innocence, where survival was a fragile thread, and where one girl's suffering would shape the future of England itself. Lady Margaret Beaufort's story was not only shaped by politics and tragedy, it was also cloaked in the aura of rumor, legend, and whispered superstition. In a world where childbirth, death, and war blended with faith and fear, Margaret became a figure who seemed touched by destiny, if not by divine intervention itself. One of the most persistent tales that clung to her was the idea that she was chosen by God to bring forth England's savior. For the Lancastrians, desperate for hope during the dark years of the Wars of the Roses, Margaret's survival of her dangerous pregnancy was viewed almost as a miracle. To give birth at 13 and live, when many women twice her age died in the same ordeal, was remarkable. When that child eventually rose to kingship, it seemed proof that Margaret's suffering had been part of some divine design. But not everyone saw her story in such holy terms. Among her enemies, the Yorkists, rumors painted Margaret as a schemer, a woman whose piety masked ruthless ambition. Whispers claimed that she plotted tirelessly, even in her teenage years, to put her son on the throne. To some, she was less a saintly mother and more a shadowy mastermind who bent fate to her will. Later chroniclers even suggested that Margaret believed herself to be under special protection from God. They pointed to her lifelong devotion, her constant prayers, her endowment of churches, her strict religious discipline, as evidence that she viewed her survival and her son's rise as part of a sacred mission. This belief, they said, fueled her endurance through endless trials. But there were darker whispers too. Some said that Margaret's almost unnatural strength and resilience were signs not of divine favor, but of witchcraft. After all, medieval England was a place where extraordinary women were often viewed with suspicion. Could a frail girl truly have endured such an ordeal without some secret power? The suggestion lingered, though it was never proven and never brought against her in court. Another rumor claimed that Margaret, even as a teenager, showed an iron will far beyond her years. Chroniclers described her as serious, almost grave, never light-hearted. It was said that after her near-fatal childbirth, she adopted a kind of holy severity, dressing plainly and dedicating herself to prayer. This image of the girl who became old before her time only deepened the mystique around her. And yet, perhaps the most haunting legend of all lies in the idea of her sacrifice. Stories circulated that Margaret had made a vow, whether to God, to herself, or to destiny, that if her son survived, she would give her life in service to his cause. The fact that she never bore another child seemed to seal this vow in the minds of contemporaries. She had given her body once for England, and that was enough. As the years passed and Henry Tudor grew, people began to look back on Margaret's ordeal as a kind of prophecy. The young widow who nearly died in childbirth had delivered not just a boy, but the seed of a new dynasty. The Tudors themselves leaned into this story, presenting Henry's birth as a moment of providence, proof that their claim to the throne was blessed. Of course, behind these legends lay a harsher truth. Margaret's piety may have been real, but it was also a shield. Her so-called ambition may have been less a lust for power and more a desperate need to secure her son's survival in a brutal, shifting political landscape. And her endurance, whether called miraculous or unnatural, was forged in suffering no child should ever have endured. Yet the legends persisted. They painted Lady Margaret Beaufort as something larger than life: saint, conspirator, prophet, mother of a dynasty. Was she truly chosen, or simply forced by circumstance into a role that history later sanctified? One thing is certain: her story, half cloaked in rumor, half grounded in suffering, became a tale retold for generations. And with every retelling, Margaret became less of a girl and more of a myth. When separating legend from truth in the life of Lady Margaret Beaufort, we must turn to the records that survive: chronicles, letters, wills, and the testimony of contemporaries. These are not the romanticized tales of later writers, but the fragments of evidence that reveal how a girl of 13 endured one of the most dangerous labors of her age, and how that moment reshaped history. The marriage records. We begin with the bare facts. Surviving documents confirm that in November 1455, Margaret was formally married to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother of King Henry VI. Edmund was in his mid-20s, Margaret just 12 years old. Such arrangements, though shocking to modern sensibilities, were not unusual in medieval politics. The marriage contract spelled out not only the union of two powerful bloodlines, but also the consolidation of Margaret's immense inheritance. Evidence of pregnancy and childbirth. The clearest evidence of her ordeal comes from records surrounding the birth of her son. In January 1457, at Pembroke Castle in Wales, Margaret gave birth to Henry Tudor. She was 13 years old. Chroniclers note that Edmund had already died months earlier, captured by Yorkist forces and succumbing to plague in captivity, leaving Margaret a widow before she bore his child. What makes this testimony significant is not simply that she gave birth, but the consequences recorded afterward. Damaged during the birth, an all too common fate for child mothers. Pelvic injuries, torn tissue, and lasting weakness were not unusual outcomes, and Margaret herself reportedly struggled with frailty for the rest of her life. Wills and property. Legal documents provide further proof of her precarious situation. Widowed and barely a teenager, Margaret's lands and fortunes came under the protection of powerful guardians. Records show she was placed under the wardship of her brother-in-law, Chaper Tudor, who became both protector of the infant Henry and steward of Margaret's inheritance. Chaper's careful management allowed Henry to survive infancy, but it also illustrates how dependent Margaret was on the political will of others at that stage. Correspondence and piety letters attributed to Margaret in later years reflect a woman of deep piety and severity. She wrote about devotion to prayer, fasting, and religious endowments. Some historians see this as evidence of personal guilt or trauma, interpreting her religious rigor as a way of making sense of the suffering of her youth. Others argue it was a calculated image, piety used as political armor in a male-dominated court. Chronicler's testimony. Contemporaries such as Polydore Virgil, an Italian historian commissioned by Henry VII, painted Margaret as a matriarch of immense influence. Virgil described her as both pious and politically shrewd, a woman who supported her son's claim with tireless energy. In all her doings, she was very wise and circumspect, of singular virtue, and always intent upon the advancement of her son. While his account is tinged with Tudor propaganda, it reveals how central her image became to legitimizing Henry's reign. Other chroniclers, however, hinted at the severity of her character. They noted her ascetic habits, her insistence on plain dress, and her tendency to dominate those around her. Some even claim she treated her household with a strictness that bordered on cruelty. Was this the mark of trauma? Or was it the armor of a woman who had learned early that survival demanded iron discipline? A case study in childbirth records. To truly grasp her suffering, we must compare her case to others of the age. Medical historians point to parish records and noble family accounts that reveal a grim reality. Girls married before their bodies were fully developed faced mortality rates far higher than older mothers. Narrow pelvic bones often led to obstructed labor, requiring dangerous interventions, or resulting in both mother and child's death. For instance, in 1461, records describe a 14-year-old noble bride who died in her first childbirth, an event mourned quietly in family papers, but never celebrated in chronicles. Such tragedies were common, and they highlight just how miraculous Margaret's survival truly was. That Margaret survived while still delivering a living son is itself statistically extraordinary. Evidence suggests her small stature left her permanently injured, yet she lived another 50 years. A testament to both her physical endurance and the luck that many women of her era did not share. Political evidence of her role. The final and most telling documents are the political treaties and alliances Margaret later negotiated. After the birth of Henry, every action she took, her remarriages, her careful maneuvering during Yorkist dominance, her secret negotiations with Elizabeth Woodville, and her orchestration of Henry's invasion in 1485, can be traced back to that single event, the survival of her son. Each of these records, marriage contracts, wills, chronicles, letters, provides us with evidence not of myth, but of reality. A young girl forced into marriage, widowed within a year, and scarred by childbirth at 13. These are not whispers of legend. They are cold lines of ink that testify to the brutal intersection of politics and the female body in medieval England. And yet, even with the weight of these documents, a question lingers. Was Margaret Beaufort merely a victim of circumstance? Or did she wield her suffering as a weapon, turning tragedy into destiny? When looking at the life of Lady Margaret Beaufort, there is one question historians continue to circle around. How did she survive? In the 15th century, childbirth was among the most common causes of death for women of all classes. For noble girls who married early, the danger was even more severe. A girl of 13, with a body not yet fully developed, was rarely expected to survive such a dangerous ordeal. And yet Margaret not only survived, but lived another half-century, long enough to see her son seize the crown of England. The medical mystery. Modern medical historians have puzzled over this. How did a frail child manage to bring forth a healthy son? Surviving records hint at the ordeal's brutality. Margaret was left physically damaged, unable to bear more children. But this only deepens the mystery. Statistically, she should have died. Was it luck? Was it the skill of midwives at Pembroke Castle? Or did some extraordinary resilience carry her through? Some scholars have suggested that Margaret may have had an unusually strong constitution. Others point to the possibility that she was aided by more experienced midwives, perhaps women brought in secretly from monasteries or noble households. Yet no record confirms this. The silence itself has fed speculation. The prophetic aura. Equally strange are the accounts of Margaret's own belief in divine protection. Chroniclers later claim she spoke often of God's will in her survival. Her piety was not just personal, it became legendary. People began to whisper that Margaret had been spared for a reason, to bring forth the Tudor line. This belief gave her an almost prophetic aura. She herself encouraged it, retreating into prayer, fasting, and a life of severity. When Henry eventually triumphed at Bosworth, supporters declared it proof that her suffering had been sanctified. Was this faith, or was it a calculated shaping of her public image? Either way, it transformed her survival into something more than chance. It became destiny. But in an age when women who stood out were often feared, Margaret's resilience bred suspicion. There were whispers of sorcery, that perhaps she had survived her impossible childbirth because of unnatural means. The rumors grew in later years, when Margaret maneuvered politically with uncanny precision. Was it possible, some asked, that her prayers were more like spells? Of course, these accusations were never proven, nor even formalized into charges. But they reflect the unease Margaret provoked. A woman who outlived plague, political purges, and the trauma of childbirth was unsettling to those around her. In a world quick to blame witchcraft, her very survival became its own unexplained phenomenon. Beyond the supernatural, there is another explanation, perhaps the most haunting. Margaret's endurance may have been less about divine favor and more about sheer will. Accounts describe her as grave, serious, and determined even in youth. She carried herself like someone far older, someone who had already faced death and refused to bow to it. Could it be that her survival was psychological as much as physical? That the same iron resolve that later allowed her to outmaneuver powerful lords and queens was already at work in that cold Welsh castle, forcing her body to endure what by all odds should have killed her? Another strange coincidence lies in the timing of Henry Tudor's birth. He was born in January 1457, just as the Lancastrian cause seemed doomed. His father Edmund was dead. King Henry VI was sliding into bouts of madness. Yorkist forces were growing stronger. And yet, in the darkest moment, the fragile heir was delivered safely into the world. Historians have often remarked on this coincidence, that at the very moment Lancaster looked ready to collapse, its future was quietly born in a castle chamber. Was this providence, or the cruel irony of fate? The final of a psychological. How did a girl of 13, nearly broken by childbirth, transform into one of the most formidable political figures of her age? Margaret Beaufort lived the rest of her life with her body marked by that ordeal. Yet her spirit seemed to harden into something unbreakable. Some believe that her trauma stripped away any trace of childhood, forcing her into a role she might otherwise never have chosen. Others suggest she was always destined for severity, that her ordeal simply revealed what was already there. Whatever the truth, the effect was undeniable. From that moment on, Margaret carried an aura of someone who had been tested by death, an unsolved enigma. So, what explains Margaret's survival? Was it luck, skill, divine favor, witchcraft, or simply a will so unyielding that death itself recoiled? We may never know. The documents of the time record the fact of her survival, but not the reason. And in that silence, legend and mystery creep in. Her life became a puzzle. A child who should have died, a widow who outlived rivals, a mother who secured a dynasty. Each survival made her story harder to explain, until Margaret herself seemed less like a person and more like an enigma. Even today, historians wrestle with the unanswered questions. In a century littered with graves of young mothers and lost heirs, why was Margaret spared? Was England's destiny resting on nothing more than chance? Or on something no record can capture? The legacy of Lady Margaret Beaufort stretches far beyond the candlelit chambers of Pembroke Castle, where she nearly died as a child mother. Her survival and her son's rise to the throne altered the very fabric of English history, and her influence still lingers in the culture, politics, and even the imagination of the modern world. Mother of the Tudor Dynasty. Above all, Margaret is remembered as the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty. Without her, there would have been no Henry VII, no marriage between Henry and Elizabeth of York, no unification of Lancaster and York through the Tudor Rose. The dynastic wars that had torn England apart for decades ended because of the survival of a girl and the child she bore. Every great Tudor figure that followed, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, traces their lineage back to Margaret's ordeal at 13. Her legacy was not only biological. Margaret actively shaped Tudor rule, guiding her son with advice, supporting his claim, and helping design the legitimacy of the new dynasty. She became a central figure in his court, wielding influence unusual for women of her time. Even today, historians debate how much of Henry VII's careful, cautious style of kingship was learned from his mother's iron discipline. Patron of education and faith. Margaret's devotion to religion and learning left an enduring mark. She founded and endowed colleges at Cambridge University, including Christ's College and St. John's College, institutions that still stand today as part of her legacy. Her vision of education rooted in faith and scholarship shaped generations of English thinkers. In this, she was far ahead of her time. At an age when most noblewomen's influence ended with their family alliances, Margaret used her wealth and authority to leave behind institutions that outlasted dynasties. The fact that students still walk the halls of colleges she founded speaks to her unusual foresight and commitment. Cultural memory and modern storytelling. In literature, draw self-sacrificing, the woman who endured for the sake of England's stability. In others, she appears as the scheming matriarch, ruthless, manipulative, even fanatical in her ambition. Modern television and novels often lean into this ambiguity. Series such as The White Queen and The Spanish Princess depict her as both a religious devotee and a relentless political strategist, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes sinister. The duality reflects our ongoing fascination with women who wield power in eras that denied them autonomy. Was she heroine or villain? The truth may be that she was both. A symbol of survival and sacrifice. In the broader cultural imagination, Margaret Beaufort stands as a symbol of female endurance. Her story resonates today because it highlights the cost of dynastic ambition on women's bodies. She was not a queen in her own right, yet she bore the weight of a kingdom. Her suffering as a 13-year-old mother becomes a reminder of the countless women in history whose lives were shaped, scarred, or lost in service to politics beyond their control. Her endurance also continues to inspire reflection on the role of fate in history. Was the Tudor dynasty born because of one girl's will to survive? Would England's history look entirely different had Margaret not lived through her labor in 1457? Such questions remind us how fragile the threads of history can be. The lasting shadow. Today, when we walk through Cambridge, past the colleges she endowed, or when we study the reigns of Henry VII and Elizabeth I, Margaret Beaufort's presence lingers. She was the girl who should not have survived, but did. And in doing so, she altered the destiny of a nation. Her legacy is not only the dynasty she gave birth to, but the enduring story of resilience, sacrifice, and the haunting power of one life to change the fate of many. In the end, the story of Lady Margaret Beaufort is not just the tale of one woman, but of a dynasty born out of suffering. At 13, she should have been a child. Instead, she was forced into a marriage that left her widowed and pregnant before her body was ready to bear the weight of such a burden. From that single act of survival came the rise of the Tudors. Henry VII's crown, the long reign of Henry VIII, the golden age of Elizabeth I, all of it can be traced back to Margaret's endurance in a freezing castle chamber in Wales. Her sacrifice changed the course of England's history, yet her life remains a paradox. Was she a saintly mother, chosen by God to deliver England's savior? Or a calculating strategist, driven by ambition and hardened by trauma? Was her survival a miracle of faith, or merely chance wrapped in the shadow of legend? What is undeniable is that Margaret Beaufort became something larger than life. She was not a queen, yet she shaped kings. She was not a warrior, yet she fought a war of endurance, politics, and willpower. She was a girl who nearly died in childbirth, yet emerged as one of the most powerful women of her century. Remember these 3 points. At 13, Margaret was forced into childbirth. That child became Henry VII, founder of the Tudor Dynasty. From personal tragedy came the rebirth of England. Today, her legacy forces us to reflect on the hidden costs of history. Behind every crown and throne lies the suffering of countless lives, some remembered, many forgotten. Margaret's story reminds us that dynasties are not only forged on battlefields, but also in the silent chambers where women paid the price for survival. And perhaps the most haunting question of all is this: if Margaret Beaufort had not lived through that night in 1457, would England ever have seen the rise of the Tudors? Would Shakespeare have written of Henry VIII and Elizabeth? Would the English Reformation, the Armada, and the Golden Age of exploration have unfolded as we know it? History often turns on fragile threads, and Margaret's survival is one of them. So now, I turn the question to you. Was Lady Margaret Beaufort truly chosen by fate to change the course of England? Or was she simply a victim of circumstance whose tragedy was later transformed into legend? And here's a challenge. Comment one historical figure you believe changed the world through tragedy. Let's see whose stories still haunt us the most. If you found this story haunting, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hidden History Vault, and share it with others who love uncovering the shadows of the past. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories of history are not about kings and warriors, but about the unseen sacrifices of those who endured in silence.